The first time I turned my husband away, he said absolutely nothing at all. He simply rolled toward the wall, and I lay there listening to him breathe in that slow, deliberate way a man breathes when he's calculating something in his head. Outside, the wind was pushing against the shutters, and somewhere down in the kitchen the old cook stove ticked as it cooled. But louder than any of that was my own pulse, hammering in my ears while I waited for him to react. I braced for shouting. I braced for an argument I could at least respond to. Instead, I got a wall of silence, and where I come from, silence like that is the loudest warning a husband can give. The second time I refused him came 8 days later. And it was 8 days after that when I finally understood exactly what happens to Amish wives who say no more than once. I learned it the way most of us learn the things nobody writes down, whispered to me sideways by another woman, at a quilting frolic, who spoke without ever really meeting my eyes. Before I get into what she told me, let me tell you who I am. My name is Ruth, and this is Bonnets and Backroads, the channel where I say out loud everything I was raised to keep folded up and put away. I was born and raised Old Order Amish outside a small settlement in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I married at 18. I left at 27, with one bag and more silence packed inside me than any suitcase could hold. If stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and down in the comments, tell me, were you ever taught that refusing someone made you the sinner? Because that's exactly what I was taught. Every single day. Here's what you need to understand going in. Out in the English world, when a wife tells her husband no, that's the end of it. Conversation closed. In the world I grew up in, that same word was only the opening move in something much bigger. Not fists, not raised voices. Something colder and, in a strange way, more effective, an entire community slowly tightening around you, one visit and one comment at a time, until one day you looked up and realized you were standing completely by yourself. Our whole understanding of marriage got built on one verse, preached from the pulpit more times than I could ever count. The wife yields, the husband decides. That was the entire teaching. Nobody ever preached a sermon about her exhaustion. Nobody stood up front and talked about the nights her body had absolutely nothing left in it to give. I remember our bishop saying once, plain as anything, that a wife who denies her husband is leaving a window open for the enemy to climb through. I was 16 years old sitting in that service, staring down at my folded hands, promising myself I would never, ever be the reason that window opened. I married a man named Amos, the spring I turned 18. He was 21, raised on a hog farm 2 lanes over from ours, a serious, quiet sort of man who rarely smiled but never raised his voice either. Everybody told me I'd landed well. Everybody told me how fortunate I was. We married on a Thursday under my uncle's pole barn, 200 and some guests, roast chicken, buttered noodles, and enough choufle pie to feed the whole township twice. By the time the last buggy pulled out that night, I'd been on my feet for 18 straight hours and my shoes felt 2 sizes too small. That first year, I look back now and I call it the training year. Amos wasn't unkind, not at all, just patient in that closed-off way some men have. I learned his habits, he learned mine. We had our first son before we'd even hit our first anniversary, and a daughter followed less than a year and a half after that. By the time I turned 21, I had 2 babies still in diapers, a farmhouse to run top to bottom, a garden the size of a small field, laundry to hand wring on a washboard my father had built for me as a wedding gift, and a husband who genuinely couldn't understand why I sometimes dozed off mid-sentence with a mixing spoon still in my fist. The night I finally said no, I hadn't slept properly in 3 days straight. My youngest had been running a fever, my oldest wasn't far behind him, and that afternoon alone I'd put up over 50 jars of green beans on top of everything else. My lower back felt like it had quietly given out and would never fully forgive me. So when Amos reached for me that night, I set my palm gently against his arm and I said, barely above a whisper, "Not tonight, please, I need to rest." He didn't move. That's the part that stayed with me all these years, how completely still he went. I felt his whole body change under my hand. Felt his breathing shift, felt the entire bedroom seem to hold its breath along with him. Then, without a word, he turned his back to me and stayed that way until sunrise. I lay awake next to him for what felt like the whole night, staring up into the dark, wondering if I'd just cracked something open that I wouldn't be able to close again. By morning he was already out doing chores before I'd even come down the stairs. He came in for breakfast and ate without a glance in my direction. He went back out. He came in again at noon, same silence. He spoke to our children plenty. He simply stopped speaking to me, for 5 days running. On day 6 my mother stopped by with a basket of dinner rolls. She set it down and watched me move around my own kitchen with that particular kind of watching mothers do when they already suspect something's wrong before you've said a word. Eventually she just asked outright, "Everything all right between you two?" And I, who had never once lied to my own mother, told her everything was fine. She just nodded slowly, gathered up her empty basket, and before walking out she said one single line to me. "Ruth, a wife who lets the fire go cold shouldn't be surprised when the whole house freezes." Then she left, and she didn't look back. I sat there a long while after the door shut behind her. I wish I could tell you I understood right then exactly what she meant. I didn't, not fully, not yet. But somewhere underneath all my exhaustion, I understood a message had just been handed to me, and it hadn't come only from her. It had come from somewhere much bigger than one mother in one kitchen, from generations of women just like her, women who'd sat in their own kitchens hearing the very same warning from their own mothers before them. That next night when Amos reached for me again, I didn't refuse. I didn't agree either. I just went quiet and let it happen. Afterward I turned toward the window and cried so softly that not even my daughter, asleep in the cradle 3 feet away, ever stirred. 8 days after that, I refused him a second time. Honestly, I couldn't tell you now what set it off. I think my body simply said no before my mind ever got the chance to weigh in. I told him, "Amos, I just can't tonight. I'm sorry, I can't." And again he turned away, and again the silence rolled in. Except this time it felt different. This time it had an edge to it. The very next morning my husband's sister Verna showed up with her 3 little ones in tow and stayed a full hour. She never once brought up Amos directly. She didn't need to. Instead she talked about a woman from a neighboring church district whose husband had eventually gone to the bishop about her. She talked about how rough things had gotten for that family afterward. She mentioned, almost in passing over her coffee, that the bishop had finally had to bring in the woman's own father and brothers to help sort things out. She said every bit of this without once looking directly at me, which, if you were raised the way I was, is exactly how a warning gets delivered. 3 days later, the bishop's wife turned up on my porch, completely unannounced. She never explained why she'd come. She drank her coffee. She asked politely after the children. Her eyes drifted slowly across my kitchen, the floor, the dishes stacked in the sink, a thin layer of dust on top of my pie safe. Then, gently, almost kindly, she told me a wife's very first job is keeping peace in her husband's heart, Ruth. Everything else in this life comes after that. She finished her coffee and left. That Saturday there was a barn raising, and it was there, behind the long-serving tables while we set out the noon meal, that an older widow named Salome, a woman I barely knew beyond nodding at her in church, set down her tray of bread right beside me and spoke without turning her head. She said, "I'm going to tell you something nobody ever told me, and I'll only say it the once, so listen close." She told me that when a wife refuses her husband a single time, that's simply weariness, and any decent man understands weariness. But refuse him a second time, she said, and now you've made a pattern. And a pattern is exactly what the men start discussing quietly by the fence line after the service. Refuse a third time, she warned, and his mother gets involved. A fourth time his father steps in. By the fifth, the bishop himself comes calling. And by then, child, she said, it stops mattering what you have to say for yourself. It only matters what they've already decided to do about it. She straightened the loaves on her tray and kept going. They will never lay a hand on you. That isn't our way. What they do instead is worse, in its own quiet fashion. They pull the warmth out of your home a little at a time, piece by piece, until you're cold enough to do just about anything to feel warm again. First your husband stops talking to you. Then his mother stops dropping by. Then your own sisters suddenly get too busy on the days they used to visit. Then the women start shifting seats at worship, putting a little more distance between you and them. Then even your own mother starts looking at you the way she'd look at a field that failed to produce a harvest. And one morning Salome told me, you wake up and realize the whole world's gone silent around you, and the only door left open anywhere is the one back into his bed. So you walk through it, and just like that, the warmth comes flooding back, and everyone's smiling at you again, and you go around telling yourself it was your own choice all along. She looked straight at me then. Just for a second. It was never your choice, she said. Not really, we just don't have a word for what it actually is. So instead we call it being a good wife. Then she picked her tray back up and walked off toward the other tables. I stood there with both hands braced flat against that rough wood, and I felt my entire understanding of my own life quietly rearrange itself behind my eyes. I wish I could tell you I marched home that evening and had it out with Amos, laid everything on the table, and that our marriage transformed overnight into something honest and equal. That isn't what happened. What actually happened is I went home, got supper on the table, bathed my children, and climbed into bed beside my husband in the dark, and I let the warmth return, because Salome had told me the truth, And the truth was that I simply wasn't strong enough yet to pay what refusing would cost me. Not with 2 babies depending on me. Not with not $1 to my name. Not with an entire community ready to close ranks behind my husband and shut every last door I'd ever known. I stayed 5 more years after that. I had a 3rd child. I got so practiced at reading my husband's silences that I could tell, just from the set of his shoulders across the supper table, whether the coming night would be one I could get through easily or one I needed to brace myself for. I became, in the only language my community had for it, a good wife. And underneath all of that, in the quiet place Salome had reached with her words that day, something small kept growing, something the community never once saw coming. I finally left when my youngest turned 4. That particular story belongs to another video, and I'll tell it properly another time. But I can tell you this much, the shunning arrived exactly the way Salome had predicted, only bigger than I'd imagined. My mother's letters started coming back unopened. My sisters crossed to the other side of the street rather than pass me in town. My father, the one and only time I saw him afterward, looked straight through me like I wasn't even standing there. But here's what I eventually came to understand, years down the road. What happened to me after I refused my husband twice, what happens to countless Amish wives in countless farmhouses, in every single season of every single year, actually has names out here in the wider world. More than one name, in fact. My counselor handed them to me slowly, one at a time, the way you'd spoon broth to somebody who hadn't eaten properly in far too long. Coercive control, emotional punishment through withdrawal, compliance enforced by an entire community, consent that isn't really consent at all, once refusing has been made too costly to survive. Back home we didn't have any of those words, we had exactly one word for the whole arrangement. We called it marriage. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you every single Amish husband is a cruel man. Amos wasn't cruel, not by his own understanding of the word. He was simply a man handed the same script I was handed, raised inside that same silence, and he followed it exactly the way he'd been taught to follow it his whole life. The bishop who preached that sermon when I was 16 wasn't some villain, either, just an old man passing along words that had been passed to him decades before. The mothers, the sisters-in-law, the bishop's wives who show up at your table with coffee and quiet warnings, they aren't monsters. They're women who once stood exactly where you're standing now. Women who once let the cold in themselves, felt the warmth come rushing back, and learned to call that warmth love, because the honest word for it would have broken something in them they couldn't afford to break. It's the system that's the real problem here, not any one person inside it. A system that takes a woman's simple no and turns it into a matter for the whole community to weigh in on. A system that decides her bone-deep exhaustion is some kind of spiritual failing. A system where saying yes becomes the only safe answer a woman's allowed to give. If you grew up somewhere your own body never fully felt like yours to begin with, I see you. If you've ever lain awake in the dark next to someone and said yes only because you were too worn down to survive what saying no would cost you, I see you too. If anyone ever told you that being good meant shrinking yourself down until there was barely enough of you left to refuse anything at all, I see you. You weren't weak. You were surviving inside a system that was built, quite deliberately, to make sure refusing always came with a price. Salome passed away about a year before I finally left. I stood at the back of that funeral in my plain dress and my cap and watched them lower her into the ground beside the husband she'd buried 50-some years of her life with. And I thought back to that moment behind the bread table, the way she'd looked right at me for just that 1 second, and the small, almost dangerous gift she'd handed me by simply telling me the truth out loud instead of letting me find it the hard way. Alone. She's the reason I understood exactly what I was walking away from the day I finally walked. She's a good part of the reason I'm sitting here telling you all of this now. If any part of this story landed with you, tell me about it down in the comments. Tell me what's still sitting with you after hearing it. And tell me, did you have your own Salome? Someone who told you the truth when nobody else around you would. If you want more of these stories, the ones that were never meant to leave the kitchen, subscribe to Bonnets and Backroads. There's a lot more still waiting to be said. Until next time, hold on to this, your no is a complete sentence all on its own. It always has been. No kitchen table, no watching community, no husband with his back turned in the dark gets to shrink it down into anything less than that.